Welcome to Sapphire Stone's children's story, and today we're going to look at the life of Corrie Ten Boom. She would call herself Tramp for the Lord. Now, children, think hard. What would you do? Would you lie to save a life? What if it was not just your life, but maybe your mom's and dad, or a brother or sister? Or if you were old enough and you had a little baby, would you lie to save your baby's life? Your daughter, your son? What about a husband or a wife? And what about 6 total strangers or 1,000 total strangers? And you could save them all if you were willing to tell a lie. But you might remember what God said in his holy commandment, the 9th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Corrie was tested on this and was victorious. We're going to study that today. We'll learn about her life and these great tests and choices she had to make. Now think again. Think hard. What would you do? Is there someone or something you could not forgive? Could you forgive the person who beat and killed your family in front of you? Well, Corrie was also victorious in this. Corrie was thrust into World War II. Now, it wasn't an accident. It didn't just happen that the World War II came into her life. It came into so many people's lives. But God had planned this to happen to Corrie, to show her who he was, and for her to learn Christ's righteousness. Today's children's story is about a woman who had to make choices between following Christ and his ways or what was the natural desire to preserve life and to lie and to hate. Instead, God thrust her into this horrible war so that she could learn of Christ's righteousness, and she chose to cling to Christ while he worked in her and through her. Now, she was not a missionary. She was a 55-year-old unmarried woman living in Holland, and she lived in her father's house and worked in her father's watch shop when World War II erupted and changed her world. However, she volunteered to save lives and live out the faith she learned as a little girl. Now, here is a picture of Holland today. What a charming place. Look at this. They get around by traveling through boats. Doesn't that look charming? But this was Holland during World War II. This was the Ten Boom family, and Corrie was the youngest of 4. And Corrie grew up having great faith. She would give Bible studies in her community, and here's a picture of her giving a Bible study to the mentally ill before the war. Now, Corrie had a sister, and her name was Betsy. And as much faith as Corrie had, Betsy had more. And they were inseparable. Corrie said, God does not have problems, only plans. And Betsy would say, there is no pit so deep that God's love is still not deeper still. I wonder if she said that before going into the concentration camp or while she was there, but she really did believe that her God was greater than any evil in this world. Now their father's name was Casper, and he led his home in deep faith, and they did Bible studies daily with him leading them. Here was the Ten Boom house. Now, Corrie's family grew very large. There were four of the children, and 2 of them got married, and they had their own children. They were all living in this house, and so they had to make the house bigger. So when the house next door to the Ten Booms became available, they bought it. And there was a 4-foot alley in between the 2 houses. And so they filled that in and tried to do their best of connecting these 2 houses. But the problem was they weren't on the same level, so that you could be on the 2nd floor in one part of the house and be on the 3rd floor in the other. And that made it very confusing when you were going up this staircase with all these doors. You never knew which floor you were going to be on. And this was a beautiful plan of God that would save many lives when the Nazis would raid their house one night. So here is the tin boom home. It got turned into a museum. Now, when the Germans came to Holland, at first the Jews were labeled, and you can see the gold stars on their outfits. So at first the Jews were labeled and not allowed to work or to shop or even to hold their positions at the university. But then they were rounded up, many were shot, most taken away in the middle of the night, with the Dutch wondering what happened to our neighbors. But then the Nazis took the Dutchmen for their factories. So virtually the town was filled with women and teenagers and children. There were very few men left, except the men that went into the resistance, the underground resistance. I like to call it the underground deliverance. And for a great book on that, you might want to read Return to the Hiding Place. And that focuses on the lives of the young teen men that sought to save the Jews from the Germans. But some brave young men did resist. They went into hiding and formed an underground resistance to save the Jews and other Dutchmen. Corrie's nephew Peter was one of the leaders, and he was 17. Now, we're not going to go into his story today, but it's quite a fascinating story of Peter and Kit and a few of the other young men in the underground deliverance. Now, Corrie became the ringleader of this deliverance program, and her home the place where the Jews were taken till they could get them out of Holland. She had natural leadership and management skills. God had developed them in her over 55 years, so he brought her to the point where he could use her skills. However, Corrie did not have that great deep faith that her sister Betsy had. She would learn that in the concentration camp. So how it all began. This is in Corrie's own words. After some time, I had 30 teenager boys, 20 teenager girls, 20 men, and 10 women. And once we heard that in the Jewish orphanage in Amsterdam, all the babies had to be killed because they were Jewish babies. And when we heard that, our boys said, "We will save them and we will steal them." And they went to that orphanage and they stole the 100 babies. Now, I think God was very happy with this form of theft. It's kind of like that which Amy Carmichael did. Now, she continues, "You will say, 'How is it possible?' I will tell you a secret. You know, sometimes there came to us good Germans, soldiers who were in the army, and they said, 'We don't like to work any longer for Adolf Hitler. We will not kill the Jewish people. Can you help us?' And I always said, 'Sure, I will help you. Just come in.' And we gave them, of course, civil clothing, and we took the German uniforms." Now, the tin booms had to have a place to hide the Jews, because they knew at any moment they could be raided by the Nazis, and they decided to build a hiding place in their home, at least until Peter and the others could get them out. A wall was built into the house. It was built into the ceiling and into the floor, so when the Nazis would bang on it, it would not sound hollow. It was a very small closet-like place, barely big enough for 6 people to sit in. And if you look here in this picture, you're going to see the hole in the wall. Well, of course, the hole wasn't there back in World War II. It looked like just a regular wall. And the way the Jews got into the hiding place is they had to get on their hands and knees and crawl in through the closet. And there was a suitcase placed in front, and there was a door that pulled up and down. So it looked very normal. But behind that closet were 6 Jews hiding from the Nazis. Now, the tin boom house, you can see why God had arranged for this house to be so crazy built. So that Corrie's room, where they built the hiding place, was the very furthest from the front door. And then remember, it was a crazy way to try to find that room. You didn't quite know where you were at when you were going up the stairways, and there were so many doors to check out, and so it gave them time. Now, they also initiated some safety measures. They would put this sign in their window, and when it was the one on the left, the little triangle with Alpina written on it, that said to the resistance, "It is safe to bring us a Jewish person to hide." But if they flipped it around and so that it was blank on the backside, the resistance knew, oh, it's not safe to bring a Jew in to hide them. They also set up a code, and they would call the tin booms before bringing a Jewish person over, and they would say, "I have a watch that needs repair." And if they didn't give that code, all the tin booms were suspicious. You see, they knew that the Nazis were watching them, and they had to be very careful. Table talk. Here is the table. So many wonderful conversations took place. The the 6 Jews would come out of hiding, and they would have dinner and breakfast around this table. Many wonderful conversations they had there. But there was one conversation that upset the Jews very, very much, and that was the question, would they lie to save our lives? You see, the tin booms knew it was inevitable. They would be asked, "Do you have any Jews here?" And so this was a topic that came up one night, and the tin booms had decided to trust God whether He would save them or not. But they would not break the 10 Commandments. Courage. Corrie had to take great risks. She had to feed a lot of people. And then, back then, you could not just go to the grocery store and buy whatever food was available. No, they gave you ration cards, and you could only buy the amount of food allowable on the ration card. And she only had a card for 3 people. By the time the war broke out, there were only 3 people now living in the tin boom home: Casper, her father, Corrie, and Betsy. So when she sat in front of the Dutchman and asking for ration cards, she had to bravely ask him for 100, knowing he would be very suspicious and could report her. She asked him for 100 ration cards, not just 3. And he said yes. He had to fake a robbery, had his friend beat him up so bad it would look real to get those cards to her. But they saved hundreds of Jews. They knew with being located near the police station so close to the Nazis, it was only a miracle of God they continued so long saving the Jews. One night they were raided by the Nazis. Corrie was very sick with the flu. So it is understandable why she made the mistake, why she missed him not asking the simple question, "I have a watch for repair. Can you repair it?" Here is what happened in her own words. "Once there came a man to me and said, 'Will you save my wife? She is arrested. She has saved Jewish people. And now she is in the police station. And there's one policeman who will run the risks to set her free if we will only pay him 600 guilders. But I have no money.' That man was a betrayer. He was a Dutch betrayer, not just of her, but of hundreds, and hundreds were killed because of his working with the Nazis. Now that night, when the Nazis burst into the home, the 6 Jews hiding there, they had already practiced over and over again how to get all the way up on the top floor and into the hiding place within 1 minute, whether they were sleeping or eating, and they had to leave no trace that they lived in the house. That meant when they were sitting at the table, and there were 6 of them, sitting around the table, or 9 of them when the tin booms joined them. That would be 9 dishes. And if that buzzer rang, all the dishes had to be cleared in such a way that it only looked like 3 dishes for 3 people were there. Now, of the 6 people living in that hiding place in the room, the 6 Jews, one was an old woman with asthma. And asthma is such a thing, when you get really stressed, you breathe really loud. And that was a constant fear for them. Would the old woman Mary, would her asthma get them all killed? And so that night came, that buzzer rang, and those 6 people made it up those stairs and into the hiding place. Mary was breathing very, very hard. But Corrie was very, very sick, and she was in bed sick when the Nazis burst into her room and yelled at her, "Do you have Jews here?" And she was so sick she could just say, "I'm so sick." And then she was coughing and coughing, and it was muffling Mary in her asthmatic attack. So the Nazis weren't hearing Mary with her asthma, but Corrie with her coughing. Now, Betsy had been the one to answer the door that night. Betsy saved them by being able to press the buzzer. It was amazing how God helped Betsy and Corrie have clarity in their mind when this happened. Now, Casper, the dad, he was in his 80s, but a Nazi guard took pity on him, offered him to stay in his home, that he wouldn't have to go to the concentration camp if he would just go back in his house and be quiet. Casper replied, "If you leave me in my home, I will keep helping any person that comes to my door." So they threw him all bloody into the truck, and his last words to his daughters that night, shortly after throwing them in, he recited to them one verse from the Bible, the one verse that he wanted them to remember, and that was Psalm 91:1. "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall dwell under the shadow of the Almighty." God's secret place. It's not a human hiding place. Casper and Betsy, they already knew what it meant to dwell in the secret place of the Most High. So different than a physical hiding place like that of the Jews in the tin boom's home. But Corrie would have to learn what that was in a concentration camp she was going to. At this point in the story, she believed in God and loved God with all her heart. But she didn't have that abiding faith that her sister Betsy and her father had, that righteousness by Christ faith. Corrie, sick as she was put in isolation because the Nazis were so fearful of sickness. They were afraid that Corrie was going to spread it to her and to everyone else. So for 3 months she was kept alone, cold and sick, while they were trying to figure out what to do with all these Dutch people, which place to send them either to execution or a concentration camp. So while she was there, all alone, a letter slid under the prison door telling her that her dear father had died, and she was thankful that he would not be suffering like she was. But then she noticed on the envelope that the address was written a little crooked and it pointed up towards the stamp. She pried the stamp loose to see a code written in Dutch underneath. It read, "All the watches are safe." Oh, she was so thankful. All 6 Jews survived. They survived that night, and they survived the war. What a testimony to trusting God. Most of Corrie's family, however, was killed by the Nazis. "Thou shalt not lie" lived out. These are Corrie's own words of how she was victorious. "When I was in prison, I was once brought before my judge, and my life was in the hands of that man. And when we testified to our faith, the Lord touched the heart of that judge. And instead of an enemy, he became a friend. But he had to do his job. And so it happened that suddenly he showed me papers found in my house, and to my horror, I saw all the names and addresses of all the people we had helped and those who had helped them. Here was the test of faith. The judge said, "Can you explain these papers?" I said, "No, no, I can't." And I felt terrible, terrible unhappy. Would Corrie lie to save her own life and those she hid? He knew better than I how dangerous the papers were, and he turned and opened the door of the stove and threw all the papers into the flame. When she saw those flames destroy those papers, it was as if for the first time she understood Colossians 2:14, where it is written that Jesus has taken the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, has taken them out of the way, and nailed them to the cross. What a wonderful victory she had. She did not lie. She simply said, "I cannot." That would be good for us to remember when we're questioned. Either say nothing at all or simply, "I cannot answer you." Now, while in that little prison, while she was in solitary confinement, a German nurse took pity on her and gave Corrie a very tiny Bible. It was so small it would fit into her hand, the palm of her hand. And God protected her in that little Bible as she would be sent to a concentration camp where they would strip her naked, and she could hide that little Bible in the palm of her hands. And God made it so that the guards did not see that. And once she hid it in her skirt, and they were doing a strip search, and they strip searched the woman in front of her, and when it came her time, they just skipped over her like she wasn't even there. And she didn't even have to take off all her clothes, and they never found her Bible. And then the great miracle of finding Betsy. Look at this sea of people. Can you imagine being in the middle of that and you catch a glimpse of your dearest sister as she's about to get on one of the train cars? Well, that's what happened. Corrie was in a sea of prisoners being herded onto train cars, and she caught that glimpse of her dear sister about to get on a car, and she shoved and pushed her way through all the way to the front and barely jumped onto that train car before they shut the door and joined her sister there. And together they went to one of the worst concentration camps in all of Germany called Ravensbrück. This was how they got there. Crowded for days with no water or food or way to relieve themselves, crowded worse than if they had crowded cattle in there, and many died on the way to Germany in that car. Now, when they got to Ravensbrück concentration camp, they found it was horrible, worse than they could ever imagine. It was designed to accommodate 6,000 prisoners, but it housed more than 36,000. And all the prisoners were women, and none were Jews. 130,000 female prisoners passed through those gates, most of whom never walked out. You see, Ravensbrück was created as a training ground for female prison guards for the SS. You see, the Nazis knew that women had a natural, merciful spirit about them. They were gentler and kinder than men tend to be, and they had to train that out of their prison guards for their evil purposes, and that was the point of Ravensbrück. The commander of Ravensbrück was a 28-year-old female. She was the most cruel of any guard there, and she took every opportunity to inflict the worst suffering and pain that she could come up with. Now, although this is not Ravensbrück, it will give you an idea of how they shoved 700 women into a room built for 200. And they were crowded and slept on the floor and on benches and basically on top of each other. But there was something wonderful about Barrack 28. It had some house guests that the Germans were terrified of, and they would not go into that barrack. In fact, they would just put the food right outside the door, and then the prisoners had to come out and get their food because the Germans were just so terrified of those house guests. And it was a great blessing. And this is Corrie telling about it. Now, when I came in that prison, we had to live with 700 prisoners in a room built for 200. It was a terrible, dirty prison, and very soon our clothing was full of lice, and those lice have caused many sicknesses. But in some way they have helped us, for the guards would never come into our room. They were afraid to get the lice from us. That was good. When I was surrounded by people who were trained in cruelty and the Bible was forbidden, we had every day, twice, a Bible study in that room where we were together in the concentration camp with 700 prisoners. That meant every day, twice a day, 700 prisoners were given the opportunity to hear the love of God from the Holy Word. Oh, what a wonderful God we serve. And now you see why. God made it so that Corrie had a little Bible in her hand, and God protected that Bible and made it so that Corrie could share his love with those 700 prisoners. Now, Corrie had recovered by the time she'd even gotten to Ravensbrück from her illness. But Betsy just kept getting sicker and sicker, to the point she couldn't work. One day, Betsy could not lift the shovel, and a male Nazi guard came over and beat her violently, beat her so bloody she lay on the ground as he continued to kick her and beat her. Finally, Corrie was able to go to her and hold her, and Betsy looked up at Corrie with a smile on her face and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry for them." But she was not talking about the other prisoners as she watched that same guard beat another. Corrie was shocked. "What are you sorry for the Nazis? Why?" "Yes, I am sorry for them. They do not know Jesus, but Jesus knows them." Betsy saw the evil actions of the guards and prayed for them to be delivered from Satan's service, even the one that beat her. She had forgiven him immediately, but Corrie hated that man. Corrie had not learned and not received the victory in forgiveness. Now Betsy started to die shortly after, unable to leave the barrack, Corrie by her side. Betsy, and with great peace, shared visions that God had given her. She told Corrie that God showed her three things that were going to happen. When they got out, they would build a home for the Dutch to recover in. And Betsy described it in great detail, how big it was and beautiful, and what they would do to help the Dutch. But then she told Corrie of the second vision. They were then going to build a concentration camp. No, I'm sorry. They were going to go to Germany, and they were going to be given by God a concentration camp. And they were going to turn it into a rehabilitation center for the Germans, the very Nazis who had caused so much suffering and were so evil and cruel to them. They were going to show them the love of Christ. And then the third vision, that they would be released by the end of the year. Betsy died shortly after, alone in a cot in a hospital. She was released from this life of suffering, and her body was thrown on a heap of bodies. And Corrie said when she found her that Betsy had the face of peace and that there was no trace of pain. She said even all the lines of suffering in her face were gone. It was December when Betsy went into the hospital. It was December 28th, in a miraculous way through human mistake, but God's great divine plan, that Corrie was released from Ravensbrück. She walked out the main gate to find her way back to Holland on foot. The next week, all the women her age in Ravensbrück were taken out, lined up, and executed. I had read in a book where she was called to go to the gas chamber, that the guard had called out her number amongst a few other ladies and was supposed to send her with a bar of soap and tell her to get a shower. But instead, she was accidentally sent into another line to be released, and they gave her the release papers, and she walked out that gate. Now, in Ravensbrück, they had the gas chambers you see here, but they also had a hospital, and many of the prisoners were told it's time to go get some tests, but these were not tests for their health, but to be experimented on, in which that usually killed the prisoners. It was a miracle to live as long as she did in Ravensbrück at her great age of 56, but more so to be released. Now, do you remember the man who betrayed her? After the war, that man was sentenced to death because he caused the death of many Dutch people. This is Corrie speaking. When I heard that, I wrote him. My sister who died after 10 months of terrible suffering, and my brother, he came out alive, but a sick man. He died from that sickness. And his son Kit never came back. I myself have suffered terribly through in 3 different prisons, but I have forgiven you. That is because Jesus is in my heart. I sent that man the New Testament and underlined the way of salvation. And that man wrote me. That you could forgive me is such a great miracle that I have said, Jesus, when you give such a love in the heart of your followers, there is hope for me. Do you remember the judge, the one that showed her mercy and threw her papers into the fire? She didn't get the opportunity to tell him she had forgiven him. That man had committed suicide. The memories of the war and the evil and the acts that he had done, oh, he was so guilt-ridden. So then this next testimony has great emphasis on the terribleness these Germans suffered after the war, after all the evil things they did. One was too hard for Corrie to forgive, but not God. After the war, Corrie went all over the world, sharing how God worked in her life and through her. After sharing her testimony, a man came up and could barely look her in the eye. It was the same guard who beat Betsy so violently, the one Betsy prayed for, that reached out his hand to her to ask her to forgive him. He told her that after the war, he had heard of Christ, and Christ had come into his life and forgiven him of all his evil deeds. And he came to ask her to forgive him. What seemed forever was only a few seconds in Corrie's mind. She cried to God silently, "Oh Lord, help me. I cannot forgive this man. Please give me forgiveness for him, for I hate him." But then she remembered and said, "I know from the Bible that hatred means murder in God's eyes," and said to herself, "Oh Father, forgive me in Jesus' name my hatred. Please give me your great forgiveness and love for this man." And at that moment, my hatred disappeared. And I said, Brother, give me your hand. I have forgiven you all. Could you do that? Is there anyone in your life you think, oh, I cannot forgive that person? I tell you, there is no one you can't forgive. There is no hurt you can't forgive, no crime, no evil. And you could do it only if it was Christ that lived in you. If you find you can't forgive someone, please ask Jesus to give you his love and forgiveness for that person. Now, why was Corrie called Tramp for the Lord? Well, it was actually what she called herself. Now, the famous book is The Hiding Place. Tramp for the Lord is one of the many books she wrote after her life. The one she called Tramp for the Lord was because when she got out of the concentration camp, she was not only very, very sick, but she was penniless, and she had very little family left after the war. But her house was still there, and she managed to get all the way back to Holland. And when she did, she put herself in the Lord's hands. And every day she asked the Lord, Lord, where will you send me today? And sometimes she would be given direction from God to go to the train station. Now, she didn't know where she was going to go, and she didn't have any money, but she would pack her suitcase, go to the train station, and she would go to the purchase window, and they would tell her, oh, there's a ticket for you. And she would take the ticket and go wherever it sent her, not knowing what she would do when she got there. And it was directions by God that would send her to Africa and to Russia and to Vietnam. And she would not know why or who she would go speak to or who she would stay with, but God always provided for her one step at a time. Now, when she was speaking around the world, she would tell her story, and at the end of her testimony, she would hold up a cross stitch. Oh, but not the pretty side. She would show the ugly side. And anyone that's cross-stitched knows there's always an ugly side. And she would hold it up, this very one you see here. And then she would say this poem. And so one night, about 30 years ago, I had been reading The Hiding Place. And when I finished the book and I read the poem, oh, it moved me. And then I woke in the middle of the night with the tune for the poem. So I'd like to sing it. My life is like a weaving between my God and me. I do not see the colors that he weaves steadily. Sometimes he weaves sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttle cease to fly will God unroll the canvas and explain the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the skillful weaver's hands as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. And then she'd flip the cross stitch over, and you could see that beautiful pattern of her life that God had woven when all she could see was pain and suffering from her view. But from God's view, he was weaving in her a crown of glory. Revelation 2:10. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. I'd like to close with this little saying Corrie said often. Look around and be distressed. Look within and be depressed. Look at Jesus and be at rest.